One gaming question that has gone unanswered for a while is, why is it that even if you had a pretty well-known developer with a good track record, either a Nintendo intellectual property or something like Sonic, why is the game so crappy in the end? Well, I think I found the reason for this. Now first, I'm going to name off all the games that Nintendo has made with third-party developers, along with Sega too, with Sonic since about 2005-2006. Let's start off with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. That game was okay, it was a financial success, but it got pretty mediocre Metacritic reviews, honestly because of how the game was and how it felt kind of different from a traditional Pokemon game. But at least they took risks, and it's still kind of better than what the Pokemon main series has become. And honestly, that's the best of all the games I'm going to name, because the next ones just get worse and worse. You had Metroid Other M, which was developed by Team Ninja, well known for the Dead or Alive franchise. That game did horribly when it came to fan reviews. Pokemon Conquest. What a crappy Disgaea ripoff. I mean, sure, it got good critic reviews because it's a Nintendo game, but it was a pretty mediocre game in general, and it was really watered down, especially compared to a real Disgaea game. Or Final Fantasy Tactics, whichever one you prefer. Hyrule Warriors. Pretty dumbed down version of the Dynasty Warriors series, which lacked many features that the main series had, such as online. Super Smash Bros. For the 3DS and Wii U. Held back by console parity, and even though it was developed by Bandai Namco, it felt more like yet another Brawl. And of course, I mentioned the creator listens to fan feedback by calling them names. Yup. Sonic Boom and Sonic Chronicles. Now, these were not Nintendo games, but they're made by Sega, and I'm going to assume the same thing of what I'm about to say applies to them, because keep in mind, both of them were pretty crappy games. And even though one of them was made by a very reputable developer who keeps releasing games that score high in Metacritic reviews and sell a ton, even though that happens, Sonic Chronicles was a disaster. Because after all, Sonic Chronicles wasn't made by some no-name shovelware developer, but it was made by BioWare, the same people who developed Knights of the Old Republic, Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Neverwinter Nights, and more. So now you might be wondering, why were all these games such pieces of crap that felt like they were being held back despite being made by some pretty talented developers? Well, let me explain why. So I think by now we all know how Namco Bandai is developing Pokken Tournament. You know, the fighting game which is going to be basically Tekken with Pokemon? Now, of course, they submitted many ideas to the Pokemon Company to have them approved during development. Now, why, you may ask? Well, let me explain why. The Pokemon Company has, quote, really strict guidelines for their games, and when they were developing it, they were actually scared and worried about how it would affect their creative control. Now, luckily, they approved most of their ideas that they had for the game, but keep in mind, they have to obey a lot of rules when they make this game. So basically, while Pokken Tournament is in development, Namco Bandai has a lot of rules that they have to obey while the game is in production on what Nintendo wants with their intellectual property. Now, what does this mean? Well, first let's look at it from a narrow perspective, and then let's take a look back and look at the big picture. First, let's take a look at the narrow perspective, though, and what it means for Pokemon in general. Now, many people have wanted some other role-playing game developer, because keep in mind, a lot of role-playing games have been coming out lately from various developers. And even though many people have wanted big role-playing developers such as CG Projekt Red, BioWare, Bethesda, From Software, and of course Atlas to touch the series, even if they touch the series, it's not going to magically get better as long as Nintendo and the current intellectual property holders own them. And why, you may ask? Well, despite the cries of many nerds online, one of the main reasons they have to hold back on the content is because Pokemon, and possibly many other Nintendo franchises to this matter, are targeted towards kids. And they said that Pokemon has a lot of kids in their fan base, and especially considering this is going to an arcade, I wouldn't be surprised at what they said about this. and what they meant with content. And on paper, considering what has been done with regards to the Pokemon fanbase's output, I can see why they would want to be restrictive with this game. However, at the same time, Nintendo's track record with Pokemon and other media has basically said that Pokemon is little more than a brand name, considering how they've actually flat out censored and banned episodes when, like, let's just say something happens like an earthquake, instead of just, say, delaying it because, you know, that's what they've done with some other shows. Or the whole Game Corner censoring, which is what they did to keep Pokemon from getting a T or 12 up rating outside of Japan. So yeah, at this point, all this does is kind of reinforce what I've said about Pokemon and Nintendo in general, that their games are little more than just brand names at this point. Games which are just made for the sole purposes of slapping mascots on boxes and selling them. But hey, what I'm about to mention next is going to be even more far-reaching. But let's take a step back from this, and let's just say that this applies with all franchises, especially from companies like Nintendo and Sega. Especially when you're making a game and you want somebody else to make a game for you, you're going to want them to make a game in your image. However, instead of hiring developers, you just pay them and they make a game how you want it pretty much. And I can also slightly understand why they wouldn't want something like, let's just say, the one live-action Mario movie to happen again. But basically, what got leaked was that Sony, with the whole North Korea hack, was actually planning a new Super Mario movie, which was going to be animated and stuff. And Miyamoto said about the whole Mario movie leak that over the past 20 years, on a fairly regular basis, people come to Nintendo with a pitch to make a Mario film, and while they haven't made one, they either end with them listening to it, or just ignoring it entirely if it's that bad sometimes. And it's happened a lot in the past 20 years, like they've said. So keep in mind, other companies usually want the rights to make something with the intellectual property, but at the same time, Nintendo and some other companies are pretty strict about what their vision for the intellectual property is. So in the end, even if a third party, like let's just say, took over development of a game, it's not going to be good if they have to basically make it by their vision and not their own, especially when it comes to staying within strict guidelines. And while there are some guidelines I can actually kind of agree with, such as ones keeping Pokemon from turning into the next DMC, on the other hand, you have games such as Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, and other games which were based off something, but the developers were allowed some freedom, and next thing you know, you have these classic games that will be played for years and years, even though they were based off someone else's intellectual property. I mean, you know, look at the Planescape Torment game, and how popular that game was to the point where people are making a spiritual successor to it. And on the other hand, just look at Sonic Boom, and look how much of a train wreck that is. But considering how these series, the ones I've mentioned that is, are pretty much train wrecks at this point, there's no fixing them even if another developer took over. As keep in mind, they pretty much want a lot of the creative control over it, so keep in mind, if you ever wanted, like, let's just say Atlas to make a Pokemon game, that probably wouldn't happen unless it's heavily watered down. Just look at Hyrule Warriors and compare it to a real Warriors game. That's all I really have to say on this. And honestly, to any indie developer who wants to make an indie game basically based off someone's intellectual property, if your game was really that good, you could make it not based off an intellectual property and you'd have full creative control over it instead of having to worry about what these people want with their brand image. And that's all I really have to say on this issue. Because while I can understand there being guidelines for working with someone else's intellectual property, the problem is, when they're working with it, keep in mind, they have to have at least some freedom or else they'll just be making the same game over and over again. I mean, just look at what happened with Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U, and that was developed by a different developer even than Brawl. That's all. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.